Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Amkraut, the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegal Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the second in our series with the Posen Library. It is our pleasure in the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program to be partnering with the Posen Library in a four-part series that will bring you expert insights with the editors of the volume. Various volumes in the series. So to kick us off for today, I'm going to hand the virtual podium over to Professor DEBORAH Dash MOORE. DEBORAH is the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library and is the Frederick G. Huetwell Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She is an historian whose work focuses on American Jews in the modern era, has served as director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and she is engaged in scholarly projects focused on New York City, specifically a three-volume award-winning history of New York Jews, City of Promises. In April 2018, her earlier book, GI Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, formed the basis for a documentary on Jewish GIs shown on PBS, GI Jews, Jewish Americans in World War II. Her current work focuses on Jewish American photographers of New York City, and I will turn the podium over to DEBORAH to introduce today's session and introduce our guest speaker for today. Thank you all for joining us.
So thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to serve in a dual purpose here. I'm going to not only introduce things, but I'm also going to run the slides and share our screen. So I'm not super adept always at this, but I hope you will stick with me as we go through the slides. So let me start by introducing ELISHEVA CARLEBACH, who is the Salo Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society, and also the director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University. She possesses a substantial and distinguished publication record, and her areas of particular interest include the intersection of Jewish and Christian culture and its effect on notions of tolerance, religious dissent, conversion, messianism, and communal governance. Among her many books, several stand out for their penetrating and unusual approach, which is also evident in this volume and what we will be discussing today. One of my favorites is a book she wrote called Palaces in Time, Jewish Calendar and Culture in Early Modern Europe. It explores handwritten calendars prepared each year by Jews. ELISHEVA uses these documents to uncover their owners' quotidian experiences and specifically how sacred and mundane intersected. In a previous book, Divided Souls, Converts from Judaism in Germany, ELISHEVA CARLEBACH argued brilliantly and I would say also persuasively for including these men and women within the compass of Jewish history. Thus, she brings to the editorship of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization in this volume 6, Confronting Modernity, 1750 to 1880, a broad engagement with key questions about how we should think about Jewish society, what are its components, and what forms of expression reflect its scope and diversity across time and place. So it's always a pleasure to talk about the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. And it's a pleasure, too, to be collaborating on this series with Case Western Reserve University. Last week, for those of you who were present, we discussed sources in the final volume of the Posen Library, that is to say, volume 10, which covers the years from 1973 until 2005. This week, we're moving back in time to examine elements of a crucial era, the years from 1750 to 1880. That mark the entry of Jews into the world that we call modernity. In both cases, The sources included in the Posen library illuminate the incredibly rich diversity, complexity, and breadth of Jewish culture and civilization. There are so many surprises within the volumes that we thought it would be fun to start with a short video that also brings a taste of contemporary Jewish music. So let's see if we can do that. Well, maybe we can't. I need to somehow move this along here. Here we go. Okay, so I'm really glad that we worked this time because music is something that's so hard to bring, and that was an example of Jewish music written by Alicia Jo Ravens, inspired by Vashti, the queen who doesn't come to the banquet. I'm done dressing up for you. So let's now turn to our conversation, okay, Elisheva? In your volume, Confronting Modernity, which is volume 6 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, you have a wealth of visual culture, and I already gave us a sample here. But before we turn to modernity itself, could we look at a few representations depicting traditional Jewish life cycle events?
So first of all, thank you for your wonderful introduction, Deborah. I always wonder which wonderful person you're describing when you introduce me. But let's focus on the volume. My volume covers from the mid-18th century, when most Jews lived in highly regulated communities. They were limited in various ways by law and governed by Jewish tradition. And the volume ends close to the end of the 19th century. During that period, the changes that Jews experienced were so immense. All of society was totally reconfigured. The Enlightenment changed the way people thought about the relationship between religion and the state. It changed the way people conceived of class, the idea that you were born into a certain station in society and stayed there forever. The emancipation meant that the law was changing to reflect these new ideals. And finally, I don't want to omit the effect of urbanization. For peasants, for Jews, the idea that they were leaving the countryside and flocking to big cities. These changes reconfigure every aspect of Jewish life. Not at the same pace in every place, of course. But I opened the volume with a wonderful quote from Isaac Marcus Jost, who said in the early 19th century, "Those of us who were children 30 years ago have flown through 1,000 years since then." The sense that there was a total transformation in the space of one generation. So this is unique in this period, that sense of everything is changing at a very rapid pace. And what we want to do today is focus on what these radical changes meant for Jewish women. So I thought we would begin our conversation by using some of the many beautiful depictions of traditional scenes that we have in the volume. Remember, the volume opens in 1750. Most Jews lived extremely traditional lives. And what I wanted to do was use some of these images to also point out how differently gendered traditional society was. So this is an image of a chuppah. The chuppah is the marriage canopy, but it's also the ritual of marriage itself. And to me, it symbolizes the traditional ordering of Jewish family life. Now, yes, details of the ritual customs differ greatly, but the basic template of Jewish marriage, the acquisition by the husband of his wife, was over 2,000 years old. The man was the active partner. Only he could initiate a marriage, and only he could effect its dissolution. Most marriages were between young teenagers. Parents arranged them. Brokers were the matchmakers. Matchmakers were the brokers. And this began to change in our period when the age of marriage rises, meaning that there's more consent by the parties involved as adults, but perhaps even more significantly in terms of the law. Civil marriage and divorce became possible. The state begins to recognize and register legally marriages that are not performed by religious authorities. So, for example, for the first time in the 1790s, a Jewish woman petitioned to initiate a divorce against her husband. Rachel Luzzatto Morsheni found herself married to a man almost 20 years her senior who had been unfaithful to her. He had syphilis, and he refused to divorce her. She petitioned and eventually won the right to a civil divorce in civil court, which ultimately led to her obtaining a religious divorce. The two are not exactly the same. So that was the first time this happened. Civil recognition of marriage and divorce also led to the possibility of marriage between people of different faiths. And although this was quite rare until more recently in the 20th century, whether people thought of these developments as positive or negative, it was undoubtedly absolutely transformative. The idea that you could envision certain arrangements that could absolutely not have been possible some decades earlier. So I want to move on now to another object that we have in our volume. This is a Torah binder known to German Jews as a Wimpel. They were often made from the cloths used to swaddle babies. They were sometimes decking the baby boy when he came to his circumcision ceremony. And when a young boy reached the age where he could attend synagogue services, there was a ceremony in which he brought this binder to the synagogue to wrap around the Torah scroll. This particular exemplar happens to have been designed by a man, a couple, son of Moses Hiller, but most of the vimples or Torah binders were not as professional looking. They were mostly designed and sewn by women. So symbolically, that directs us again to the highly gendered nature of Jewish ritual life, when rituals around the life cycle from birth to death cemented these distinctive roles, in this case of men playing most of the leading roles in synagogue life and women playing the roles of facilitators.
This is such a gorgeous one. I love the peacock.
Yes, it is that's why I chose this example, but it's actually much fancier than many of them, which tended to be, you can see that they were homespun, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
And finally, I want to go to our last image that depicts traditional life. This is a wonderful picture out of a series from the Prague Chevra Kadisha. It depicts part of what was called an act of true loving kindness, chesed shel emet, which is what any service to the dead was called. Now, as this series itself shows, women had their own Chevra Kadishas. They were just as active and just as attentive to the female dead as men were to the male dead. Nevertheless, what you see here is a very gendered depiction and distinction between the activities on each side. The men are seen as cutting cloth for the shrouds, and the women are seen as sewing the shrouds. And I thought this was a beautiful image because, as Deborah had pointed out to me, notice that on both sides there's an old person and a young person. So there's this act of mentoring and maybe initiating the younger generation into the tradition. But it struck me that the women are depicted in the one activity that had always been gendered female. It's not the only thing they did, but it's the only thing they're shown as doing. And again, that's in a kind of nutshell, something about traditional society. Your place in society was first and foremost dictated by your religion and secondly by your gender, almost intertwined and unchangeably.
So that's a wonderful background for our conversation today. And you chose Jewish Women's Voices as the title for our conversation. Was there a feminist movement or consciousness, even what we could call a women's movement in the late 18th, 19th centuries that Jews were involved in?
So I used the term voices. I did not use the term movement with deliberation because there was really no collective movement on the part of women, Jewish and non-Jewish. In fact, the 19th century famously might be seen as an era of regression. Women in the early modern period famously worked out of the house, but during the so-called Victorian era, the age of the ascendance of a middle class, the bourgeoisie and its values, its ideal for women was domesticity, dabbling in culture, cultivating the domestic arts. And Jewish women of that middle class actually find themselves within that rubric. They too are being forced backwards into the home in the 19th century. So women breaking out of traditional roles doesn't happen in a straight arrow progression. I think what we're seeing here is the acknowledgement by individual women that things need to change, but very little progress in terms of institutions welcoming women. Higher educational institutions were almost uniformly closed to women. Civil service jobs in the government, uniformly closed to women. Training for the professions, the idea of political life. In all of these aspects, institutions are barring women, but individual voices are breaking out. And that's what's distinctive about this period. They're breaking out in all different directions despite the institutional barriers.
So maybe say a little more about what you mean about breaking out. Are you talking about becoming more visible in the Jewish world, or more present in the larger non-Jewish world? What's behind that language of breaking out?
So I want to say again that I don't want to claim that in 1749 we have no women's voices, and by 1751 they've become eloquent and loquacious. That's not really true. Jewish women had voices and expressed themselves in letters and wills and books of morals. Think of Glickle of Hamelin, the famous 17th century memoirist. But these were almost all written for private purposes in Jewish languages, mostly Yiddish. And because they were written privately, even Glickle wrote for her descendants, not for a public, they really weren't known. Very few of Glickle's contemporaries ever heard of her or knew that she wrote this. And I just want to put in a little plug for a new translation of Glickle's memoir. Even if you're familiar with it from the old one, this one is based on the scholarship of Chava Turniansky, recently published by Brandeis University Press. So please familiarize yourself with it if you have any interest in the history of Jewish women. But Glickle wrote her life story again for a private purpose. By the 19th century, in our period, Jewish women are writing for the broad public. They're writing in the languages of the larger society. They're also participating in literature in both Hebrew and Yiddish, as well as vernacular. And these voices are beginning to stand out and be heard in the larger world.
So do these Jewish women also agitate for change within the religious sphere in this period?
So again, on an individual basis, I love this picture. So the audience will forgive me if I invoke it. But this is Maurizi Gottlieb's Jews praying in a traditional configuration in a synagogue. And you notice that the women's gallery is separate from the men's. And on first glance, you would actually think that this is about the men in the center of the picture who are carrying a Torah and praying, with the women's gallery kind of off in the back. Again, as ancillary to what's happening front and center. But if you focus on just what's going on inside the women's gallery, you see something very different. It's full of life. Women are conducting their own business. They have their own agency, their own voices, their own things that are going on. In fact, while some of them seem to be conferring with one another about what's happening inside the men's section, you'll notice that others are not paying any attention to it at all. There only seems to be one woman in the back there praying, and then there's another one standing. Mm-hmm. She may have been the women's prayer leader, the Fürsorgerin, or maybe now I'm thinking that's a charity box. Maybe she was collecting charity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. By the way, women collected charity in the women's section for poor women. So So even in this very traditional depiction of a traditional scene, you see some movement about women being far more active players than we traditionally tend to think of them. But in terms of moving forward into the 19th century, we see the transformation of tradition even more explicitly. So I want to begin with one very interesting example. These are different language covers of a modernized version of a very traditional genre. Trinus, prayers of supplication, were something that women prayed. They uttered it at special moments in Jewish women's lives. The conventional Siddur, for example, did not have a prayer for when a woman went to the ritual bath to purify herself. It didn't have a prayer for many when a woman was pregnant and wanted to pray that her child should be born healthy. You can open up a conventional Siddur and you'll not find anything that is appropriate for those types of women's life cycle events. Trinus fill in that blank. They begin to appear in written form with the age of print. They probably go back to the Middle Ages as an oral tradition. Mm-hmm. But what Fanny Neuda does is she modernizes this tradition, and she publishes in German. That's the first cover you see all the way on the right. And then in Judeo-German, in 1855, her Hours of Devotion, which were such an absolute raging hit that by 1866, they had been published and translated into English, and her work was reprinted close to 30 times in the 19th century. This was a real bestseller. So it shows you how women are taking something that was traditional, updating it for modern times. She was a writer of other things as well, stories for Jewish children, very important in terms of fashioning Jewish identity. So here's an example of somebody who is not starting a movement, but she's moving things forward in a certain direction within the religious tradition. Another voice I want to mention is not a woman's voice, but the son of a rabbi who recalled his father giving lessons in the women's section of their synagogue in Provence, where he was born. And he felt that women were not being given enough of Jewish education to allow them to move forward. He noted that in his parents' generation, women had no religious education at all. Religion for them, he says, was entirely material. And he urged Jewish communities to end the prejudicial exclusion of women from participating fully in the worship service, and in a very passionate essay. So I felt that his voice ought to be included. It wasn't only women advocating for women. There were men who felt as well that Jewish life couldn't continue in a vibrant and creative way without including the voices of Jewish women. And by sheer coincidence, in my volume, the very next entry after Lissabon's takes us into a totally different world, takes us into the world of Penina Mois, a Sephardic woman who was an active member. Her entire family were deeply involved in one of the earliest Reform congregations in the United States. This is the Charleston Reform Synagogue. And I want to just take a moment to look at the depiction here. It's a painting from memory of this beautiful synagogue, which burned down in 1838. And one of its other staunch members, Solomon Nunez Carvalho, painted this picture from memory. That was in 1838. In 1840, photography was invented, and he became one of the early and brilliant photographers who went with John Fremont out to the West. And his photographs constitute some of the earliest American photography. So I just wanted to give him a little plug as well.
Especially he takes photographs of Native Americans.
Of Native Americans, of Africans.
Very interesting.
And they're very moving photographs, and they really distill and preserve aspects of the culture at that moment that would not otherwise have been preserved, certainly not photographically. And so back to Penina Moise. Here we have a woman who answers the call for participation in Jewish religious services by renewing them in certain ways. Penina, together with another Sephardic woman from Charleston, founded a Jewish religious school, one of the first in the United States. And she wrote a collection of hymns in English because she wanted everybody to be able to understand and participate. She was actually the first Jewish woman in America, as far as we know, to have published a collection of poetry. So I put a few selections from her hymns in the volume. Hymns for humankind's self-knowledge, essentially an appeal for human humility. Hymns for the various holidays, including Passover, celebrating, bondage hath ceased and freedom's feast was now being celebrated by Jews, divided by space, but linked by fate and feeling.
She's such an interesting figure, Penina Moise. One of the things that the Reform Society of Israelites, which her brother was, involved with and led, and she joined, was the creation of a revised marriage ceremony, right? We began with the chuppah, and in this revised ceremony, they give the bride words to speak, right? So that's a sign of their radicalism. But she's also a really complicated figure. I mean, here she is in Charleston in 1867. She celebrates, Jews' freedom from bondage. But what about the battle over slavery that had just been fought in the United States?
So as far as I could tell, Penina's family was deeply entrenched in Southern culture. They supported secession, which essentially meant upholding slavery. And even though I haven't found writings from her specifically on that, she does appear to have been embedded in that worldview. As appalling as it may seem in hindsight, the fact is that Jewish women can be found on both sides of the divide. And that means that they were deeply integrated into their surrounding society. So on the one hand, we have somebody like Ernestine Rose, who was born in Eastern Europe, emigrates to New York. She had a horrible time in Eastern Europe when her husband tried to claim all of the funds that she had brought into their marriage. And she came to New York and essentially started anew. But she advocated forcefully for women. She was a suffragette. She fought for the right of women to vote. But she was also a passionate abolitionist. So you have her on one side crusading against slavery. And then you have many Jewish women in the American South who were, as we said, deeply embedded in its culture. And they not only accepted, but they even endorsed the way of life that made slavery possible. I have an excerpt from Emma Mordecai's diary, in which she shows how deeply the values of Southern Confederate culture penetrated, even in a woman who proudly upheld her Jewish identity. So she writes in her diary about the vexatious and mischievous Negro movement. She writes, "This morning, Cy," so Cy is a former enslaved man, came to high words, insisting he had a right to stay here, to bring whom he pleased, to keep his family here. He was, he said, this is still a quotation from her diary, entitled to a part of the farm after all the work he had done on it. The kitchen belonged to him because he had helped cut the timber to build it." And she concludes with a description of the exodus of the former enslaved by writing, "Now they'll begin to find out how easy their life as slaves had been and to feel the slavery of their freedom." Reading this today, it really makes one's hair stand on edge. You know, whatever happened to the Jewish sensibility that should have made her so much more sympathetic to the plight of the enslaved. But
It's
this
really,
is
it's really,
the fact. You can't change
yeah.
history.
Also what she records as his demanding. I mean, that's a wonderful piece that lets us see what some former enslaved men thought, right, about how they had in fact built the farm and built the kitchen and the kinds of rights. So it has real value in that regard as well. But it's saddening to see that Jewish women were so much part of their larger cultural context that they stood on both sides of the slavery question during the Civil War, obviously, as did Jewish men. Were they equally divided about the role of Jewish women in Jewish life, or the role of women in Jewish life, I should say?
So again, there's a real divide between what I would call the public and institutional barriers that still exists, and individual voices. So we already mentioned Ernestine Rose, who spent decades fighting for the right of women to vote, and interestingly and personally for her, she fought and succeeded in introducing legislation that allowed women to keep the assets that they brought into their marriage if the marriage dissolved and during the marriage. This is, you know, this seems so much of a gimme almost, but the fact is that by civil law, when women married, they lost all rights to everything they owned. Their husband owned everything.
Right.
And just to look at a different part of the Jewish world, in the second half of the 19th century, you have somebody like Rosa Gabay in the Ottoman Empire, who writes in Ladino from her home in Istanbul, urging Jewish women and girls to seek their own advancement, because she writes, the men are not going to do it for us. If we want to have a place in the world, we're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to earn it. It's not going to be given to us. And I just want to say finally, something that caused a tremendous amount of heated give and take in Eastern Europe. The two editors of Polish Jewish journals or newspapers, Uri Kahan and Alexander Zetterbaum, wrote editorials promoting the education and opportunity of girls and women. And their advocacy produced such a storm of reaction that they felt they had to apologize, and they did so by saying, our Jewish grandmothers were wonderful women. We weren't trying to in any way diminish their importance by advocating that women today might have other needs. So there were many Jews who embraced Western culture, but opposed an expanded role for women. There were others who saw this as an age of greater opportunity and wanted nothing more than to overturn the old order, and including women in their more expansive view. So there's a real variety of voices, but there's no movement.
Okay, so Jewish grandmothers come to the rescue, as it were.
Yes.
So we noted before the turn of Jewish women to writing, not just privately, but for an audience. What can you tell us a bit about Jewish women in the literary world?
So I'm just going to say a few things because our time is growing a little bit short-ish.
Right, it is, yes.
I want to pull out another Luzzatto name. This is an Italian Jewish woman who was born into that eminent Italian Jewish family, the Luzzati. She was one of the early Jewish women to write poetry in Hebrew. And she writes a beautiful poem, which Deborah put up here on the screen. And I'm just going to read the final lines here. It's not the whole poem. She writes, I've looked to the north, to the south, east, and west. In each, a woman's word is lighter than dust. Years hence, will anyone really remember her name in city or province any more than a dead dog's? Ask. The people are sure. A woman's wisdom is only in spinning wool. And she signs it, wife of, instead of putting her own name, she signs it as wife of Jacob Morpurgo, stillborn. The sense that her voice, even though it had been alive and vibrant in her lifetime, would not somehow carry forward in the same way as male poets would have. And I thought that was very sad. Her poems were not published in her lifetime, but they were printed shortly afterward by one of her admirers, who put them together in a book called Rachel's Harp, Ugav Rachel. But interestingly, in the late 20th and 21st century, her work has been rediscovered. Some of it has been rendered now in English. There's a scholar in Israel, Tova Cohen, who devoted an entire biography to Rachel Luzzatto Morpurgo. So her voice is being heard now.
That's great. So obviously women wrote in a number of different languages, and one of the wonderful aspects of the Posen Library is its extensive translations from these different languages into English. What about some Jewish writers in English? Could we jump to them, or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So even though we have indeed included many voices of women, and I just want to mention one or two, people should avail themselves of the selections and then follow the trail of the bibliography and read the whole work. Samson Raphael Hirsch, for example, who was the founder of Neo-Orthodoxy in Germany, had a daughter, Sarah Hirsch, who wrote beautifully in German stories to strengthen Jewish identity in Germany. And these have never been translated until recently. The late Jonathan Hess brought some of them into English translation. But in English, amazingly, two of the most important and early Jewish writers in English were Sephardic women. So Emma Lazarus, famous, shown here, in the United States, and somewhat less well known because she lived in the United Kingdom, Grace Aguilar. So here are two Sephardic women who are writing beautifully in several genres in English. Of course, Emma Lazarus is most famous for her poem, which at this moment in history seems perhaps more relevant than ever. You know, her famous poem, The New Colossus, which is inscribed in the Statue of Liberty, and which ends, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send them, send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." These are immortal words. Again, just a few out of a rather broad body of work. Both of them were involved in Jewish religious education for women. And sadly, both of them actually died when they were quite young, still in their 30s, but yet had left behind such a rich legacy in their work.
I think that Emma Lazarus's use of the language "mother of exiles" is such a Jewish understanding, because so many of the immigrants were not exiles. They could go back home again, right? But she imagines them in this very Jewish way. So I'm looking at the time also, and I just wondered if you might speak a bit about the ways in which Jewish women and men confronted modernity, because that's in your title itself.
Yeah, so there are many different ways, and I'll just want to say briefly, you could go across the religious spectrum from women who really were founders of the reform movement in Germany, like Amalie Beer, who opens up her salon, her living room, to the first reform services. You could think about people like Rachel Webermacher, known as the Maiden of Ludmir, who was arguably the only Hasidic leader who was a woman. You could think about Eva Frank, depicted here, who was the daughter of the founder of a movement, I have to say a quite perverted movement, if you will. But, you know, just the very idea that women could lead religious movements, could play founding roles. Even 50 years earlier, it's hard to imagine that that could have ever happened. And by the 19th century, it's happening all across the religious spectrum. So they're confronting modernity as individuals who are growing into roles that they couldn't have played earlier, even while society is kind of lagging or tagging along behind them.
So one of these Sephardic women is pictured here, Grace Mendes Seixas Nathan, and she is someone from the colonial U.S., right? So it's interesting to think of her in that regard. Do you want to say a little bit more about these?
So just very, very briefly,
okay.
I want to talk for a second about this image, which is a silhouette. Silhouettes had become very popular in this period just before photography.
Right.
So again, it's an example of Jewish women arranging for themselves to be displayed in a way that was expressive of their role in the forefront of society. But Grace Seixas Nathan was a pillar of the Shearith Israel Synagogue, one of the first in the United States and in New York. She also wrote prolifically, even though most of her work was not published in her lifetime. And she, in a certain way, represents so many other Jewish women who opened up their homes and devoted their lifelong talent to enriching Jewish life in their communities and supporting it.
And I think we have someone across the pond, as they would say,
Yes.
right?
So, here's another study in contrast, if you will, and in a certain way, we could say, Lady Judith Cohen Montefiore, pictured here, embodies the contradictions of the age that we've been discussing. On the one hand, here was a woman to whom limitless possibilities were open. She and her husband were among the great philanthropists ever in 19th century Europe. They were ennobled. They traveled the world. There was no luxury that they could not afford. She had every education, was cultured, and she wrote a fascinating diary of their trip to the Middle East. She describes what Jerusalem and Egypt looked like in the 19th century from the vantage point of a woman, and it's very, very interesting. By the same token, she had published anonymously initially. She just, if you look at the title page there, I don't know if you can see it, it's called The Jewish Manual, and it is by a lady. She didn't say which lady, but there weren't that many people who were actually ladies, ennobled. And it's a combination of a cookbook, an etiquette book, teaching women how to serve, not just how to cook certain dishes, but how to set a table and how to be elegant, how to be a member of society. It's such a contradiction. On the one hand, her imposing domesticity on other Jewish women, which is what the age in which she lived expected, while she herself was living with some of the greatest possibilities that the age could confer on women. So she embodies in certain ways this contradiction.
So I think one of the things that's fascinating also about this is the turn to written texts to transfer tradition rather than mimetic, right? Where girls would learn from their mothers how to do it through experience. I'm going to jump us to a favorite image of mine, and one that you ended up choosing to be on the cover of the volume. And it comes from this Haggadah that Charlotte von Rothschild did. So can you say some things about why you chose this Haggadah and a selection, one of the images for the cover of the book itself?
Okay, so just to repeat a motif, Charlotte von Rothschild, and I want to assure the readers that we did not favor wealthy, cultured European women. We just happen to have picked them because we have permission to use these images. Charlotte von Rothschild, again, was somebody who was born into one of the most privileged elite families in all of Europe by the time she was born. She was immensely learned, many languages, music, art. She had tutors in every skill anybody could have possibly wanted. And yet when it came time for her to do a special project as a gift to one of her Rothschild uncles, she decided to invest an absolutely enormous amount of resource, her skill, her devotion into making this beautiful, handwritten, hand-illuminated Haggadah for Passover. And it's written both in Hebrew with some translation into German on the facing pages. As far as we know, it is the only Haggadah to have, manuscript Haggadah, to have been written by a woman. She completed it in the 1840s. And I chose one image from it to be on the cover of the volume. because that image expressed to me, distilled in a certain way, the openness, the optimism, the possibility that characterize this period. Some women across the religious and geographical spectrum responded in innovative ways that expanded the possibilities for women in Jewish life. In hindsight, they laid the groundwork for many of the developments that followed, and these developments remain with us until this very day.
Yeah, well, that's just wonderful, Elisheva. This is one of my favorite images of Miriam, right?
Yes.
Leading the women in song, and I love the fact that they are front and center. And Moses, you know, he's there, but you know,
that's how the Bible depicts them, but people
right,
don't tend to remember that.
Right, he's in the background.
But the fact that that this was meaningful to her, I think, needs to be meaningful to us.
Yes, I think so too. Okay, well, you've really given us this wonderful sense of the richness and diversity of these years, and especially the multiple ways in which women were involved and came to express themselves, to challenge certain standards, but to innovate, but also to continue, because there was a great deal of continuity as well. I think I'm going to stop the sharing now, and we can turn over to some questions. So the questions, okay, what can I see? I see questions, it looks like in both chat and Q&A. I don't know, Brian, are you still around? Are you able to do questions? Or
I am. I'm happy to post some questions.
Okay, because there are a lot of them. I'm only just looking at them right now.
Sure. So I'll start with the ones that came in the Q&A.
Okay.
This is sort of a long question. You might be aware of the edited version of Moritz Gottlieb's work with the women removed, evidently to meet audience sensibilities. So if you are aware of that, could you comment on the removal of women's images and what it means for historical research?
I am not familiar with that. In all the scholarly research that I've come across, images of women were not removed. Moreover, women play such an important role in his biography. Gottlieb is said to have starved himself to death, basically, in his distress over the loss of his first love. So again, you know, people can chop up images in many different ways. This is not the only one that contains women. And I don't know what, you know, at what point in history that was done. So unfortunately, I am simply ignorant of this, and I can't answer that.
No worries. Do you think the reason Jewish women worked for changes in the public realm was of the changes urged by men to have a civil status recognized by the governments in which they lived?
So yes, I think the two quests are in a certain way related. Once you make the argument that the full humanity of somebody demands their equality under the law, I think that you can't really exclude any category of people from being looked at as equal under the law. Only it takes some time for that recognition. But yes, I think, you know, once you have liberty, equality, fraternity, you realize that equality can't really happen for all of society until it happens for everyone.
So here's a question, someone who's familiar with the volume. In this volume, you include Yehuda Leib Gordon's Tip of the Yad, in which he angrily sympathizes with women's lot. He even mentions Agunot. Was he the rare male who seemed to understand this lack of equality?
So I think he was one of, we mentioned some others. I spoke about Alyssa Bon and others who were men who actively, so let me say a word about what I think is happening in Tip of the Yud. Yes, it's about sympathizing with women's lot, but I think it's also about criticizing traditional society. And it's a combination of both. If you want to point out what were some of the main flaws of living under a halachic society, the status of Jewish women, particularly the example of the aguna who gets chained in a marriage that's dead, maybe to a man who may be dead, but there is no evidence or not sufficient evidence for that. This has always been something that vexed even the greatest halachists, who also sympathized with the women's lot, but somehow felt that the traditional law could not simply release them. And so Gordon is doing double work in his criticism, so to speak.
Here's, I think, always an interesting question when you're doing the type of work you did. What did you find that especially surprised or perhaps even shocked you when you were doing the research for the volume?
Thanks for that excellent but general question. So I have to admit that I came to this volume, like so many other people who I hope will come to the Posen Library, as somebody who was not that familiar with this period. The one that I specialize in as a scholar is an earlier period. So much that I discovered about Jewish life, again, across the spectrum, across the geographical, the chronological, the gender spectrum. All of this was news to me. And what particularly impressed me across so many different and sometimes difficult voices was the commitment to better their lot, the commitment to be a part of society that is moving forward, whether that meant Jewishly, and sometimes it meant abandoning Judaism. I know that it happened, but sometimes hearing the voices, seeing the work that emerges around those decisions, these were eye-opening things, because these are individuals who are expressing their dilemma, their choices, the sense that they really did still feel limitations.
And maybe
all of these were news to me.
So maybe there was a particular item that you came across that was just really surprising. You wouldn't have expected to see something like it.
Some of the letters of rabbis that make them very human, that are in this volume. You know, these were just beautiful and moving and surprising, and in many ways, you know, I would refer the questioner maybe to the letter of Rabbi Akiva Eger.
That's a wonderful letter. Absolutely.
Yes, it's actually a famous letter in some circles, but it shows him to be so deeply human and feeling. It's you know, so those were some of the surprises, the things that you wouldn't expect from somebody who's known from one genre alone, and then expresses themselves in a completely different language and in a different way, showing a different side of their humanity.
Yeah, this was the letter that he writes after his wife dies, his first wife. Yes, and it's really very powerful, and he's known as a great rabbinic figure, but not for
right. So in the world of rabbinic scholarship, he's known for his rabbinic scholarship. But that letter is and that's not the only example we have of people writing about their own lives in ways that give us a completely new insight into them as people, as opposed to simply the subjects for which they were famous for.
So we encourage everyone to go read the letter.
Absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit more, you know, you talked about the role of Jewish women in the arts, but were there specific areas that they were encouraged or discouraged from pursuing?
Well, thank you for that question, because that's something we had hoped to get to, but didn't really have the time. Right, so what I want to say, just in brief again, is institutionally, there were tremendous barriers In order to be an artist, you had to attend one of the academies and be trained, and you had to have patrons who would help you show your work and pay you to sustain yourself from your work. And this is true in all the arts, the fine arts, painting, music, and so forth. Almost universally, women were barred by these institutions. And yet there were some Jewish women whose work we have in our volume who were so gifted and so devoted to exploring their gift that they actually painted, they paid for themselves to be educated, and their paintings were displayed in the very academies of art that wouldn't allow them to register as students.
Yeah. You know, if I can go back to one of the more general question about the surprises, one of the things that you discovered and indeed translated, right, was Jewish midwives. And that had not been, as it were, on your research agenda. So that I think is really a very valuable contribution.
Yes, it's such a rich subject it turned out to be that I actually have a student who is writing a book about Jewish midwives in the pre-modern period because they were so central to every Jewish community. There's a lot of material about them. So keep your eyes open for when Jordan Katz publishes her work, which she's written a very brilliant dissertation, and it will come out as a book one day. But yes, I decided not to spend my next few years exploring it, but just the very existence of their writing. They were record keepers, and they wrote about some of the things that they experienced. And to be able to include that into this volume was wonderful, and in certain ways life-changing. And because you realize that here are these women professionals, it's their skill, their training, their knowledge that's in demand. They are the ones who sometimes come into a Jewish community and say, you better give my husband citizenship if you want me to come and stay here.
Which is great.
Yeah.
So there's only a few more, so let's hopefully we can get them all in the next few minutes. We have a methodological question, as there were many minority voices that you're uncovering. How did you conduct your research? How did you know which rocks to lift to find these voices?
So the mandate was to try to be as global and inclusive as possible. That's what my training as a historian prepares me to do, to sift through a tremendous variety of sources. Again, some things could not be included for various reasons, whether that was permissions or translations, but for the most part, the Posen Foundation gave me carte blanche, and I really did interpret the concept of Jewish culture and Jewish civilization in the broadest possible way. Anything that could be construed as a Jewish experience in this period, an expression of it, I tried to represent in some way. I couldn't include every voice, but I tried to put every stream of Jews and Judaism in there. And again, I leave it to the readers to judge whether I succeeded or not.
When you were discussing the Jewish schools earlier, and so someone asked, why do you think it was Sarah Schneerer who got the title as the, quote, first woman who opened a school for young women, if there were other women who did it before her?
Good question.
Okay, that's a great question. And I'll make some distinctions. She wasn't necessarily the first woman, certainly not to open a Jewish school. As we said, there were others in other parts of the Jewish world. The one that Penina Moise opened was more of a Sunday school. It was a kind of supplementary education. What Sarah Schneerer opened was a residential school, which actually took Jewish girls in. They lived in the school. And she helped shape their worldview completely. So these are very different types of schools with different goals. Sarah Schneerer in Poland was really fighting against the lack of any type of Jewish education, to the point where Jewish parents who had Hasidic sons in Hasidic courts and were sending their daughters to Catholic school to get an education. And they found that the daughters then grew up not having enough knowledge, not having enough ability to lead a Jewish life. And she felt that that was a crisis, it was reaching a crisis point, and she decided to start that school.
So the last question, as we're very timely, as we're heading into the end, hopefully, of election season, did Jewish women seek the vote in their lands during the time period 1870 to 1919? So were Jewish women active in the suffrage movement?
They were. Again, I have the voice of Ernestine Rose, who I mentioned was a famous suffragette, and there were others. The answer is yes.
All right, Deborah, I turn it back to you to close us out. Thank you both.
All right. Well, thank you. It was really wonderful to go back in time and to look at these years of enormous change through the lens of gender, and to think about the multiple roles that Jewish women played and the ways in which they are part of Jewish culture and civilization. I mean, and to my mind, that's one of the more radical dimensions of what the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization is about. That is, that it sees women as well as men as producing this culture. So I think I have one last slide that I conceivably could share with everybody. And I'm going to give it a whirl. Yes, there it is. So this lets you know where you can obtain the volume if you wish to purchase it with a discount, or you can get it for free. It's actually www, we're missing a W there, posenlibrary.com, and go and discover these resources for yourself. We gave you a taste of the many riches, as well as the intellectual rationale for their choices that ELISHEVA CARLEBACH made when she produced the volume, but now is an opportunity for you to go to discover them yourself. So this is the informative slide in that regard. And thank you all very much for participating, as they say, in this event. And thank you, ELISHEVA CARLEBACH, very much.
Thank you, Deborah.
Well. Yeah.
We had a wonderful editor-in-chief.